Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Danny and today I have a book I'm just dying to talk to you guys about. I don't do a lot of really in-depth reviews of books on my channel, and I had such a fun time with my vlog of Mayfly that it's kind of been in my head since then. And I recently read a 5-star book that I really want to have a conversation with you guys about. So I thought I would try this out. If you guys like the format of this video, if you like the in-detailed reviews of books, this is going to be non-spoiler, even though I am going to give you guys details of like the world building and writing style, things like that. I'm not going to spoil anything about the plot or any like main character points, anything like that. But I am going to give you guys details about the books that I don't in some of my wrap-ups because of how limited time is with how much I can talk about the books in those videos. So I just wanted one whole video designated to this book because I just think it deserves it. Also, before we get started, if you notice that my bookshelves are different and my camera setup is different, I'm not as close to you guys as I normally am. I did reorganize my office and so things are looking a little different. I am going to show you guys my reorganization of my bookshelves. I just haven't put that video together yet, but that's why my setup looks a little different. So without further ado, let's get to the book. The book I want to talk to you guys about today is Kings of the Wyld. I freaking love this book. Obviously I gave it 5 stars, but I wanted to talk to you guys specifically about why I liked the book, what aspects of the book I enjoyed, who I would and wouldn't recommend the book to, and just have a conversation with you guys about this debut, which I did not realize that going into this. And yeah, see if you guys have any questions for me in the comments or any suggestions. If you've read books that are similar to this, let me know because I would love to continue reading stories like this one. I'm going to start with giving you guys the general premise of this book if you haven't ever heard of Kings of the Wyld. So we start with Clay Cooper, and he is the perspective we follow throughout the entire book. Clay Cooper is a member of a legendary band from the past. So by band, I don't mean rock band, although there are some references to make you believe that this is similar to how we as a culture in modern history have kind of idolized bands in general. But instead of being a rock band in this fantasy world, they are mercenary bands. And these mercenary bands are known to protect the realm from these monsters that are within the realm. And they have in the past been hired to keep certain towns safe. They are known to seek out glory and infamy by essentially getting themselves into a whole load of trouble and facing down some very crazy monstrous creatures that are in what's called the Wyld. And Clay Cooper is from the legendary band called Saga. Saga is known to be one of the best, if not the best, band from 20 years ago. And they have since disbanded and they are currently living their own lives. They each have their own different stories that you learn throughout the book, and they are on kind of different paths at this point in time. So at the very, very beginning of the book, you have the head man of Saga, whose name is Gabe or Gabriel, comes to Clay because they live in the same area and asks Clay if he will help him get the band back together. And yes, they do use those words. So Gabriel wants to get the band back together to save his daughter. His daughter is in some very dire circumstances, and I won't tell you why, but she has gotten herself into a situation that is essentially hopeless, and everyone has kind of written her off for dead, and Gabriel is not going to give up on his daughter, and knows that he has friends that have in the past done legendary things, and so why can't they do it again? And I can't remember if I said this, but they were legends and their band was together 20 years ago. So it has been 20 years since they have done all of these legendary things. And so they have aged quite a bit in those 20 years. Things have happened. Their lives have grown. Some of them have families. Some of them have kingdoms that they're running. Some of them have businesses that they're running. And so you have all of these moving pieces of people's lives and the impacts of age, as well as distance from one another because they don't all live in the same town, that are going to cause some conflicts with getting the band back together. And so the whole story, the premise of the story is them getting the band back together and going on one last journey to save Gabriel's daughter. And first off, I love that trope. I love it when people who are kind of past their prime get back together for one last hurrah. I have had a lot of fun with that. The most recent one that I read was The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, and I freaking love that book. So I was already on board whenever I heard the premise of this book, but some of the things that this author did were just fantastic. This is a debut author, or a debut novel, and I did not realize that when I read it. I was going through and reading some reviews after, and that's how I found it out, but this is amazing. Not only, like, I love the book regardless of whether or not it's debut, but the fact that it's debut and it was so good is just incredible, and I can't wait to read more from this author. So I did rate this book 5 stars, and with most of my 5 stars, but with most any book, regardless of what rating I give it, I can love a book, give it 5 stars, and still realize that it's not going to be for every reader. And so what I wanted to do in this review is talk to you guys about some of the things that I absolutely dearly loved, to give you some perspective on how the book looks and how the book feels to the reader. And then I also want to talk to you guys about some of my concerns with other readers going into this book. So I'm going to start with the things that I absolutely loved. And the main kind of wow factor for me in this book was the massive world full of monsters. I don't know what it is, but I enjoy a world that uses there are lots of worlds that have monsters in them, but a lot of times it's very focused on a specific type of monster or a set of monsters. This just goes crazy. It puts any mythical creature, any monster that you've ever heard of, it puts all of them. All of them are in this book. And I freaking love that. The book that's done this most recently, which I ended up not loving this book, but was the Haunted Forest tour that I read. And that was one of the aspects of that Haunted Forest tour that I really loved, was they had this creepy forest that had these monsters all living in one place that were so brutal and gruesome and dangerous. It was just incredible. And that's what this book does, except for it's more vast. They do have what's called the Wyld, which is a forest or a wilderness that has a lot of these monsters in them, but even within the villages, there are things that are happening, monstrous things that are happening to the people that are even outside of the wild. It's just within the wild, they're more condensed. Another thing I liked about the monsters is not only does this author put in like the classic fantasy monsters, wargs, dragons, wyverns, sorry. All of the things that you would think of in classic fantasy, but it also puts in some new monsters that you've never heard of before that they will describe. And just some of the creativity in what some of these monsters do in the wild. There is a plant that literally screams using the voices of the victims that it had previously, which was super eerie and creepy. Like things like that, I really put you in the element and put you in the characters' perspective of being absolutely terrified by these things that are surrounding them. I also really enjoyed how this story starts so small and it gets gigantic. And so you start in the small village with Clay Cooper and Gabriel, and they are journeying to find the rest of their bandmates. And throughout that journey, you get little bits and pieces throughout, which I appreciated. And it was always in a convenient moment. So when something pops up, whatever that might be, if it's a magical element, if it's a different character and maybe a relationship that you can see between two individuals, whether or not it's hatred or love, there would then be a story that gets brought in from the past that explains that particular thing. That doesn't happen all of the time, but for the big pieces it does. And I liked the way the history of the characters was woven together in that way. It doesn't completely take you out of the story because you're still in the present with them, but it gives you enough context to really build a faith and a distinctness in all of the characters that you meet in this book. And that leads me to character relationships. So the relationships within this storyline are just amazing. The main fact of the relationships that really did it in for me is the fact that we have 5 main male characters who are the members of this band saga, and the brotherhood that they form and the history that they have with one another, the reactions that they have to one another. Sometimes it's banter, sometimes it's a very sentimental, emotional moment. I really enjoyed. There is definitely humor in this book, and I think that it's balanced very well with the emotional pieces, especially because I know that a lot of times when people are not comfortable with emotions, humor is something that they will use to show love or to kind of hide their feelings. And so I found that very relatable in the story with these men. It's also really, I like the contrast of having these manly men, these gruesome, vicious killers in their past and in their current day, also really enjoying each other's company and joking around, being jovial with one another and showing their love for one another. I thought it was just really lovely to see them grow throughout the book and for us to learn their histories as well. I also really enjoyed the fact that these are characters of legend and we're with them. So there's a quote at some point, and I don't know who it's by, but it says, you never want to meet your legends, or you never want to meet your heroes, I think is what the actual quote is. And this book kind of exemplifies why, because meeting a character of legend, obviously there are going to be some things that were glossed over, some things that were made bigger than they actually are, and we get to see the nitty-gritty of these characters of legend, and we get to hear their legends along with it, with these people that interact with them on a day-to-day, how other people perceive them, and then you are actually in the thick of it with them, and so you know what's true and what's not true, and I really enjoyed that dynamic with that. So with the band in general, you get to see the fact that these 5 men who have worked together to fight all of these really dangerous monsters actually filling in each other's gaps. So all of them, they're human, they have flaws, but as a band, as a whole, they help each other when the other is weakest, or whenever the other is weakest. And so they do kind of fill in each other's gaps to make a very succinct group of men that work really well together. Along with the relationships, there is also a discussion of aging in this book because of the circumstances these men are in and the fact that they are 20 years past their prime and they are doing things that they might not or should not be able to do at their age, especially being that they haven't really been practicing their skills for the last 20 years. And so that discussion, the discussion of life and growing apart from one another, but also the discussion of mobility and tiredness, weariness whenever you are on a trek and you're hiking across distances. Who's going to get tired, or what's the difference from 20 years ago to now? I really enjoyed those discussions throughout the book. I think they were handled really well, and I think it's fun to see the growth of those characters in that way and how they decide to handle it. There's one character in the band, and I won't tell you why, but is in a different situation age-wise than all of their other bandmates, and so seeing the contrast between the bandmates who are much older and the bandmate who's not, it was just a lot of fun to see that, especially in such dire circumstances in the middle of the wild, surrounded by monsters, with people who are hunting them. I really appreciated seeing how they handle those certain situations being older. I also really, really loved the side characters in this, and I would absolutely eat up any other stories that this author wants to do. I have heard that there's going to be, I know there's already a second book published, but I'm not sure about a third. I haven't looked. But I think that they are all technically standalones. There's a through line, I think, that the author said, but they're each going to be about a specific band. But there are characters in this they're members of a band, but they're also just side characters that I would love extra stories about. There is a character in this called Kit the Unkillable. I want to know his story. I would absolutely eat up a book about Kit the Unkillable. I would also love to see a book about Jane. I'm not going to give you guys details about these characters because you'll have to read the book, but there was a story or a character named Gregory and Dane who I freaking loved, and I don't necessarily think that you could write a story about them individually. Maybe a novella. I don't know. I'm just putting it out in the universe. But the side characters are so unique and either lovable or hateable depending on who you run across. And I love a book with a huge cast of characters, especially when I can pick out the distinct characteristics of these little tiny side characters that are not the characters of legend. Some of them are, but some of them are not characters of legend. And I think it's so fun to have such a vast amount of personalities to kind of bounce off of this story. It was a lot of fun. And lastly, I will say, and I've already kind of mentioned this, the humor in the book I really enjoyed. And I know that humor is something that is very hit or miss with people because humor is subjective, and so your sense of humor might not be the same as mine, and so that is very hard for an author to write. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the dumb luckness of the book and how the characters, even though they are characters of legend, are not experts at their field by any means, and sometimes they just luck into things. And I also really enjoyed the crude humor within this book. If you guys have ever read anything by Scott Lynch, specifically The Gentleman and Bastards, this type of humor really reminded me of that book. And so I love a dark, gritty humor. It's something that typically works for me, and it absolutely did with these killers of men, legendary characters who are going on one last journey a little bit past their prime. So with all of that said, I think that if you are interested in this book, you should absolutely give it a try. But I just want to give a couple cautionary things that I think some people might have issue with or take issue with. I did not. I absolutely love this book. I find all of these flaws acceptable in my brain, but I know that they will annoy some people. So the first of which is, I think that if you are not super familiar with fantasy, if fantasy is not your main genre, if you haven't read a whole bunch of books with fantastical creatures, mythology, monsters, things like that, I do think that this book doesn't handhold when it comes to describing the monsters within the Wyld. There are definitely new monsters, like I talked about, creative things that the author has done that I was not familiar with, but there are also some monsters that are very familiar with fantasy lore that there's not a lot of description for. I do think that the author does some. For instance, there was a description of why dragons are different than wyvern, but there are also some creatures like ettins and wargs and things like that that I didn't feel like the author really went into great depth in describing them, which I thought was fine. And really, if you're reading the book and you know that it's a monster and you don't have to have in-depth details, maybe that wouldn't bother you. But just so you guys know, if you do go into this book and you don't have familiarity with some of those terms, there might be some creatures in here that you don't know about. Secondly, I do think that the convenience of the magic in this and the convenience of some of the things that happen throughout this book might annoy some people. And it is something that I noticed throughout the book, but I was having such a fun time laughing out loud and I don't know, just loving this cast of characters that the convenience of certain things didn't bother me. But I do know that that's something that a lot of readers do not enjoy. That kind of ties in with the dumb luck as well. There are definitely moments in this, and even the author addresses it at one point in time at one of the massive battle scenes that there are in this story, which I didn't talk about that and what I loved. This author does do battles very well. The descriptions of how the characters play off of each other in battle scenes is amazing, and I enjoy a good battle scene. It's very fast paced within those battle scenes, but then we also have the slow down moments after. And so the pacing of those I thought was really good, and the adventure that you feel like you're on throughout these battle scenes, the tension of what's happening. Some of the humor in the battle scenes is also great. The character Moog, which is one of the members of Saga, is absolutely fantastic during the battle scenes. He is a hoot. And if you've read the book, you might find a hoot to be a pun, because there is a specific thing that Moog is obsessed with. Anyway, I won't get into that, but there are dumb luck moments within those battle scenes that the author does address. Like, sometimes it's not because these people or these men are characters of legend. Sometimes it's just because they got lucky. And I was perfectly fine with that, but it just depends on the reader on whether or not you're going to be a little bit annoyed with the fact that it's not skill that sometimes gets them through. And then I already talked about the fact that humor can just be hit or miss with people. And so I do think that that's something also, if you're reading the first, I don't know, maybe 10%, and you're not liking the writing style, maybe you're not finding certain characters funny, I don't know if that would get better. I really think I would wait until you're introduced to Moog. And then if you're still not finding things funny, maybe the humor is not going to be for you. But anyway. And then the last thing, I did think that certain of the stories that I talked about, the past stories to give you guys information, was a little info dumpy. I did not mind it, because I do think that I like it when authors take a piece of information that you need in the moment, and then they will do kind of like a flashback to show you why this piece of information is important. I don't mind that, but there are definitely moments in time that it feels like, okay, this story really doesn't matter except for this piece of information. I thought it added texture to the story with the flashbacks and the little moments in time. I also think that it added to the legendary nature of these characters, because we get little bits and pieces of their history throughout this as well. And so I thought it worked, but I know that some people are very sensitive to info dumps within their stories as well. So those are my thoughts on The King of the Wyld. Have you read this book? Are you going to read this book now that you've heard about it? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. If you have any books, if you have read this, or just hearing me talk about it, you think that you have some books that are similar to this, please leave those recommendations in the comments. I would love to add to my TBR, because I freaking love this and I can't wait to continue with the series. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you have a lovely evening, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.